Okay, thank you very much, everyone. I want to apologise at the outset. I'm a late inclusion for speaking today because my colleague Gabriel has the most terrible cold. So sympathies to Gabriel, and apologies if I do ramble a little bit. I think you heard a little bit about Pundi X just before, but the rough rundown is that we're founded by a mix of tech heads and people from fintech, and we're founded in Indonesia. And the reason we chose that market, as I said earlier, is because Indonesia is one of those economies, like many in the developing world, that has a large population of unbanked people. So according to the latest estimates from the World Bank, half of people in Indonesia don't have a bank account, and as I said before, a further half of those don't even have a bank card. That's those who do have an account. And of course, at the same time, there's this great wave of cashless payments innovation sweeping certain parts of the world. I mean, you look at China and you go to a Starbucks in China and you try and pay in cash and you'll get a quizzical look. I mean, everyone's using things like WeChat Pay, Alipay, things like that. I was told that they wouldn't take my money at a Starbucks in Seoul the other day that had gone completely cashless. But it hadn't really arrived in perhaps the places where it most needed it. And so to that end, we tried to take that spirit of cashless payment innovation that had been and put it where it was most needed, and that was Indonesia, which is obviously has long been described as one of the sleeping economic powerhouses of the world. It's the world's fourth biggest country, but its economic power has perhaps not translated for various reasons. And so we founded Pundi, which was a QR code payment app, and it was a screaming success. 100,000 users in Jakarta. It was the most popular app by active rate of users. And at that point, we sort of thought, why not take things a bit further? Why not go global? And at the same time, there was a huge surge of interest in cryptocurrencies, in blockchain technology, and all the rest of it. So we had our ICO in January 21. We closed it out in 90 minutes, and we raised $35 million. So to that end, we used it to create our product, the XBoss. We actually developed one before the ICO to show people what it would look like. But the idea is basically pretty simple. It's a blockchain-based point-of-sales device running on the Ethereum blockchain at the moment, but we have our own in development, more on which later, that allows users to buy, sell, and transact in cryptocurrencies. And it's pretty simple. I might just give you a quick demonstration, get things out of the way. So at the moment, we have 4 cryptocurrencies available for purchase on the POS, but we're expanding that to 13. So you simply just go to your store. I'm going to run a transaction for $1 Singaporean dollar in Bitcoin. Or am I? No, I am. Thank you very much. Okay. So, sure. I mean, we've just chosen our cryptocurrency in Bitcoin. There's our receipt, and as we lock in the price, the transaction locks, so any volatility on the upside or the downside is worn by us, by Pundi X, so the merchants can be sure that they're not going to be hit by a sudden fall or rise in Bitcoin value. We click OK, card payment, and there we go, it's done. And that's your receipt. So what we've tried to do with all of this is replicate the existing experience of retail as much as possible, because businesses are kind of conservative people, but in countries like Southeast Asia, we were very popular. In countries like Korea, Taiwan, there's a huge interest in cryptocurrencies amongst those populations, and businesses want to tap into that. But by the same token, the way in which the process flow of a business goes is very conservative, and there's a traditional model, which is you use your card, you interact with the point-of-sales device, you tap it, and you go. And so we tried to emulate that as much as possible. I mean, there's other ways of doing things. Obviously, people use apps, and we have a mobile app version of our card. This is the XBoss card, which is basically just a physical representation of your cryptocurrency wallet. But we've tried to make things as retail-friendly as possible. And this kind of goes back to the original vision, I guess, of cryptocurrencies. I mean, we just had the 10-year anniversary recently of the Bitcoin white paper, and I know this issue has caused a lot of fissures within the cryptocurrency community, but if you read the white paper, it was envisioned as a form of cash, which is something that people actually use. But so far, there haven't really been that many opportunities for them to use it easily. So our goal is to convert the 99.9% of people who don't own cryptocurrencies or who are intimidated by the need to navigate public keys, private keys, and things like this, and make it as easy as possible, and make it something that they can understand. And that's what we've been doing with our point of sales device. So since launch, we've started shipping in September the first 5,500 pre-orders for our devices, and they're going to various locations. We've had a lot of interest from South America, namely Colombia and Brazil, where 1,000 XBOS each are going. And that's perhaps not surprising when you look at South America's history with inflation and things like that. But of course, there remains a lot of interest in Asia as well, and we have some smaller consignments in UK and Switzerland. We've grown our presence to 150 employees. We have offices here in Singapore, in Jakarta, in Shenzhen, in Seoul and Tokyo, as well as, I think I mentioned, London and Sao Paulo. And that's where we're up to. In terms of our developments, we've actually progressed along the path of producing another device. So I mentioned we are developing our own public chain. We had a look at the existing network of public chains, and we didn't think they were up to scratch. So we've created what we've called Function X, which is going to be a blockchain that allows for you to transmit data along the blockchain. And we had a demonstration of our first product that will make use of this, the X phone in Bali last October, and we made a phone call along that. What makes it different from other mobile phones is that instead of routing everything through a centralized carrier, calls, messages, etc., are transported through a network of nodes, and they're entirely private. So you have an exact control over who sees your messages, who sees your data. And last week in New York, our CEO, Zach, demonstrated the use of decentralized apps on our blockchain. We created a ride-hailing app, and we used it to order a cab from Midtown Manhattan to Central Park. But what we see this potential as being is to create a truly decentralized blockchain environment where you can sort of, in the example of ride-sharing apps, you're not dependent on an intermediary. So if you're a service provider, or if you're a content creator, or if you're someone who simply browses the internet, you can be sure that you're not at the mercy of a central carrier. And I think we've seen a lot of interest in applications like this, Signal messaging apps, Wickr messaging apps, people increasingly concerned about what Facebook is doing with their data. And we hope to use the blockchain to this purpose. And so all our XBOS devices, we're targeting a rollout of 100,000 by 2021, and our mobile phone devices as well, which we're launching in the second quarter of next year, will be nodes for that Function X network. And we hope that that will be the next stage of evolution in our desire to bring blockchain, I guess, to the forefront of everyday life and into the hands of people. And that goes back to our reason for being, which is to promote the greater adoption of blockchain in life. Any questions?
I wanted to know what the differences between your platform and something like Omise is. Is it a matter of being in different countries, or are there fundamental other differences?
Look, I suppose what makes us unique is that we are manufacturing, a hardware device, which is pretty unusual in the world of blockchain. There are similarities. At the moment, we're both running on the Ethereum blockchain. But I suppose what we want to do, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about replicating the existing retail experience and making something that can sort of slot into that. And so I suppose the distinction is we're coming at payments as well, but from the angle of, rather than perhaps overturning the status quo, how do you mesh things into the status quo? With the view that that's perhaps the best way to promote them. So look, I'd say that's the distinction, the fact that we're a hardware-based point-of-sales device.
Any more questions?
Yeah, I wanted to ask, most of the merchants, they would have their own POS stations, right? So, and then you guys have your own POS. Did you find any frictions or challenges when you go to, try to sell to them? And why is it you guys decide to use your own POS hardware?
Yeah, look, it's a very good question, and there are people who are moving into the blockchain cryptocurrency payments space now, and some are taking that other approach, which is trying to integrate with existing POS platforms. I suppose it depends on how cynical or optimistic you are about how amenable those companies are to letting cryptocurrency payments and blockchain companies integrate with their platform. People tend to be pretty secretive when they're running payments devices, and they tend to be pretty covetous. I mean, if you're making a lot of money on transactions, I mean, it's a $2.2 trillion industry every year, payments, and some of the bigger players, I think, are probably less amenable to doing that, especially because at the moment, blockchain and cryptocurrencies remain the province of sort of this 1% of early adopters, or even fewer than that. But so, yeah, look, that's why we took the approach. I mean, more or less, it didn't seem like there was much appetite for doing that. I know companies like MasterCard and others are filing patents quietly in the background, but there hasn't been all that much progress, and there is demand in these countries for that. Also, it's quite limiting. I mean, the rollout that we set ourselves is to be have 100,000 of these devices rolled out by 2021, and so the way in which the global market for payment devices is fairly fractured. There's about 700 in the world, and so let's say you cracked a deal with Verifone, and then you might have the American market sorted out, but then you'd have to go and crack on with Ingenico to get to Central Europe, and then you'd have to crack on with a different provider to get to Africa or whatever. But it does pose challenges, yes. I mean, you have to convince people that this is something that they need, and this is something that's worth having, which is why we have, you know, handsome sales guys like Gabriel to do the smooth talking. But it depends. I mean, there is demand for it in these markets where you have a lot of early adopters, and that makes the case a lot easier. But yeah, you have to intrude into a process flow, and that is a challenge, yeah.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for sharing. So I just want to know how do you, your company convince the local whichever new market to accept your technology, or how, is it through certain workshops or some conferences or whatever?
Do you mean the market, or do you mean regulators? Or
regulators, to be exact. Yeah.
Good question. I don't think regulators take much convincing. I mean, sorry, they don't brook much convincing, I should say. I don't think regulators are typically looking to be convinced about why they should allow cryptocurrency payments from a cryptocurrency payments company, because, you know, we would say do that. So I think regulators tend to make up their own mind, and it's been interesting to watch. Some have been very, very conservative. You know, Indonesia's a very good example. Others have been more welcoming, and others sort of don't say anything at all. And so in those cases, you know, well, in every case, we do our utmost to adhere to the law in every sense. But it's been interesting working within those markets. And I mean, there's just not much that can be done when a regulator puts down their foot. But what's interesting is even in the countries that, as I said earlier on the panel, even the countries that are quite hostile to this, we're seeing a lot of interest in central banks looking at creating their own digital tokenized currencies, even if they're stable pegs of their own national currency. I think Christine Lagarde said only last month that central banks should all be looking at that. And so that's been an interesting area for us, is that these countries, these markets in which regulators have been otherwise hostile, you're starting to see interest in getting in front of the blockchain trend, but doing it in a very regulated manner. And of course, you know, our hardware can do that too. Like I said, Dubai is one of our biggest markets, which is not something we would have anticipated.
Thank you. Could you please address a little bit about the function of your token? I understand you have a token as well. What are the token economics there?
Sure. So yeah, the token is called NPXS, and the functions are many and varied. So for one thing, NPXS is used if you want to list your token on our XPOS. We take deposits in that. If you want to clear transactions as a merchant, 10% of the fee that goes will be NPXS that is burnt. If you want to publish apps on the App Store, as I think I mentioned before, encouraging the creation of decentralized applications. We built and demoed our first one last month, but upon the launch of our blockchain, we're going to be launching an app store as well, and we're looking to expand the function of the XPOS to include things like membership management programs, customer loyalty programs, and even bespoke applications, for taxation, for inventory management. All of that will be done via NPXS as well. It's also a token that is loaded onto those devices.
Thank you, James, for your talk. I have two questions, actually. I'd like to know what is your typical spread and charges for merchants and customers, respectively? And number two, how did you manage to convince merchants to accept you?
Okay, good question. Typical spread. Gabriel? No. What is it? The fees are pretty low. So we're going for a 1% fee. Is that right? Yes, 1% fee. And we have most of that goes back to the merchant. So it's roughly a 70-30 split with the merchant. They do the best out of that. And so that's our aim. We're aiming to be competitive with Visa, with MasterCard. I mean, you have to beat those guys to be in the game. And the spread, it sort of is determined somewhat by the locality, right? So, I mean, we have various liquidity partners in various markets. So that would be somewhat dependent, but it's all displayed pretty transparently, and it's fairly minimal. I mean, at the moment, we're seeking to make our money, like most people who do payment processing, through high volume, low margin business. I mean, and you have to sort of be like that to be competitive. So the other part of the question was, how do you convince merchants? I suppose you have to convince them that there's a need to do this. And I mean, I think that's what everyone in the cryptocurrency world is trying to do at the moment, right? I mean, we've seen this great explosion in interest, but people have noted that perhaps adoption lags behind it. I mean, everyone in this audience is probably, a member of the church choir when it comes to that, but other consumers, not so much. But I suppose we have followed demand roughly. I mean, we have a huge amount of interest, for example, in our products in Korea, and that's not something that we had necessarily planned. But it just so happens that you run up the flagpole and certain markets seem very interested. And so the job is kind of done for us there. We have a very active local community there. In Taiwan, for example, one of the latest places we've installed the XPOS is a cryptocurrency-themed bar where you can order a Bitcoin or Ethereum cocktail. And I mean, that's a pretty easy sell, right? Like, I don't know that that's too hard to join those dots. But in other markets, it's a question of convincing people that it will be useful. I mean, there's other selling points as well to the device. I mean, it retails, depending on how much you buy at once, for between $250 and $300, which is pretty competitive. I mean, I come from Australia where there's a monopoly, or more or less a monopoly payment provider called FPOS, and you'll pay that much in monthly rental fees in Australia if you're a medium-sized business for a point-of-sales device. So by comparison, owning something outright is quite useful for that. The other thing, like I said before, we've tried to do is make it as similar to an existing point-of-sales device as popular. I mean, we've got the EMV slots in the top and the bottom. We've got a QR code camera at the back. So, I mean, if you don't want to use it for cryptocurrency payments, it's like the old joke about the escalator. If it breaks, it still stairs. I mean, it still can be used as a point-of-sales device. So I suppose that would speak to some of the more conservative merchants. But I suppose we're at the stage of the adoption cycle where the ones who are really keen, or who have customers who are really keen, are quite easy to convince. The next step will perhaps be more interesting.
I think you mentioned earlier you're on the Ethereum platform. So how about things like scalability, processing like Visa, credit card, sort of amount of transactions and speeds, for example? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, that's the biggest question, isn't it, for blockchain and for payments? And that's why we've sort of branched into our own blockchain, Function X. Because, scalability, compared to Visa and MasterCard, I think the stat everyone always brings out about Visa is that they can operate at 24,000 transactions a second. A lot of people cast doubt on whether they ever get anywhere near that, even on, Christmas Eve in New York. But still, I mean, that shows you that to compete with these guys, you have to be not as good as them, but better than they are, And so the way we're going about that is every XPOS device that we have, will be a node in this Function X blockchain ecosystem. And so the idea of that is that as the network grows, so do the node size. And we'll be able to hopefully use that for certain solutions to the scalability question, like sharding and things like that. We'll be able to have a wide geographic spread of nodes across the markets in which we operate, and be able to generate consensus among those quickly and reliably. So that's our answer to the scaling problem, is that the devices that we create, I mentioned the X phone, they'll also function as nodes. You know, I mean, how many nodes does Ethereum have? It's what, I think we're at 15,000, something like that. Or in Bitcoin, perhaps 8,000. I mean, at the moment, we've shipped 5,000 of these in the field. We have pre-orders for more. The NEM Foundation is going to run, has put in an order for 20,000 devices to run on the NEM blockchain as a side project. So, you know, hopefully, in time, we can eclipse Ethereum. And in so doing, we can have a network of nodes that are devoted to running our transactions to meet the scalability issue. But, you know, it is the big one. You've identified it. Yeah.